Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently holding for further traffic clearance.
This is your Walt Disney World picture phone operator. How may I be of assistance?
You know, somehow Disney Fantasy seems a little more alive at night. In fact, it was Walt's favorite time at the park.
Your attention, please. Last call for the Walt Disney Railroad, now departing for a grand circle tour around the Magic Kingdom.
Lights. Camera. Action.
WDW Radio, your information station. Hello, my friend, and welcome to the WDW Radio Show, your Walt Disney World information station. I am your host, Lou Mangello, and this is show number 558. And I'm here once again not only to help you have the best vacation experience when you go to the Disney parks, but I also want to bring you a little bit of Disney magic wherever you are with the podcast, my live video broadcasts on Facebook every Wednesday night, books, audio tours, special events, blog, and more. Whether you're a first-time visitor or have been to the parks hundreds of times, if you're planning a vacation or love the details, secrets, stories, and history, there is something on the show and the site for you, because each week I'm going to take you from the parks to the screens and everything in between. And if you're a new listener, welcome, and I invite you to go back and check out some or all of the past episodes for interviews, top 10s, reviews, and more. You can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and visit WDWRadio.com. Did you know that in addition to Disneyland and Walt Disney World, there were plans, and lots of them, to build additional parks in the United States? From St. Louis to Mineral King, from the East Coast to the shores of California, there were a number of ideas that were very close to being built. And this week, we'll look at some of the many unbuilt and lost Disney parks concepts, including a few you may never have heard of or realized just how close they were to becoming a reality. We'll look at where they were going and why, the reasons why they never came to be, and where some of those ideas eventually ended up. I'll then have the answer to our last Walt Disney World trivia question of the week, and I'll pose a new challenge for your chance to win a Disney prize package. Then stay tuned to the end of the show. I'll have more information about our upcoming WDW Radio events, our next meet of the month in Walt Disney World, your voicemails, and more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's episode of the WDW Radio Show. At Disney, it's always been said that no great idea ever dies. Or does it? While countless concepts have most likely been shelved, literally and figuratively, over the years at Walt Disney Imagineering, some have been blue sky concepts, while others have probably been much closer towards making the dreams and designs a reality. And some may have eventually been dusted off, modified, tweaked, and implemented elsewhere, but maybe weren't always exactly what they had in mind. And while some of these concepts have been attractions, resorts, shows, and probably even full theme park additions or expansions at Disneyland and Walt Disney World, there have been some other ideas that have been much bigger, much bolder, unique, and exciting, and would have existed far outside the berm of either or both parks. In fact, they would have been another Disney park, mostly in North America. So this week, we're going to peek into the archives of Imagineering, figuratively of course, and explore some of the lost Disney parks concepts that were never built. And joining me is a fellow Disney fan, and by fan, I mean history nerd, friend, longtime member of the WDW Radio team and family. She is Kendall Foreman, who I think this is your first time ever on the show, yeah?
It is.
We have known each other.
Box appearances, but that's it.
We've known each other and been friends for a year and for a very, very long time. You were the brains and the brawn behind the WDW Radio blog and getting your content and the content of so many great writers up on the blog. So for that, I appreciate it, as well as this idea. This is something that I think I have touched on in very much sort of peripheral kind of ways. We would mention some of these places in passing, but this was sort of your ideas in terms of focusing specifically on these much grander site-based new parks, not even really expansions, around the country.
Yeah, this was something that ever since I started blogging, ever since I got my first iPod Touch, I would keep notes in there of things that I wanted to write a blog post about. And I think this has been in there for years. And I keep looking at it and I'm like, I got to write that. And I just could never come up with the right way to convey it in a blog post. I just felt like it was something that would be better talked about with someone else to reflex with. And so it just sat there until finally I decided when I was done being editor, it was time to cash in my chips and get to be on the show.
Well, and like I said, I dig this. And over the years, you and others have published a ton of blogs on the site, from a series called The World That Never Was, where we talked about Genesis Gardens at Animal Kingdom, Equatorial Africa, the Animal Kingdom Carousel, Thunder Mesa, Dick Tracy's Crime Stoppers, Soviet Russia in the World Showcase. And I've also done on the show a number of different series. So back on show number 91, I did the Lost Resorts of the Magic Kingdom, the Asian, Persian, and Venetian. The World Showcase That Never Was, Wayback Machine on 105. The Muppets in Walt Disney World, not just what is and was, but what almost was, on show 251. We took the Walt Disney World Wayback Machine to the Disney Decade and the Michael Eisner era back on show 426, and many of his ideas that came to be and some that didn't. And most recently, I think the latest Walt Disney World That Never Was series was Beastly Kingdom on 481. And I know somewhere in there we also talked about Roger Rabbit and Hollywoodland and Hollywood Studios. But this week I really want to focus on some of the big projects. And I think some of these will be ones that you may have heard of and maybe some that you haven't. And we're going to talk about why they were going to get built and why they didn't. And then at the end, I'm going to ask you which one you would have liked to have experienced most. So, Kendall, this is your idea. Chivalry is not dead. I still believe in ladies first. I wanted to ask you if you had one that you wanted to go to first, but I almost think starting chronologically earliest on with one of the early expansions to Walt Disney's Mineral King might be a good place to start, because I think that was probably the one that was not only never built, but was one that people have heard of a lot, but was also earliest on in terms of timing.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have my favorite amongst our list of what we're going to talk about, but I agree, because all of these kind of just flow into each other, especially when we get closer to the Eisner area. It's like you almost can't talk about one without talking about another.
So for those people who are or maybe not familiar with what Mineral King is, what was the idea and where was it? And why did Walt want to create something that was going to be something very, very different than the huge success that he had with Disneyland?
Well, you can find like a little short interview clip online where Walt's just briefly talking about Mineral King, and he mentions that he started skiing at Badger Pass, which was a ski resort there in California. And then he invested in Sugar Bowl Ski Resort, which ended up in them actually renaming one of the mountains there, Mount Disney. And it's still that today. If you look at their map, there's Mount Disney, there's Disney Meadow, there's the Disney Express lift. And that's where the first chairlift was ever in the state of California. And they did that with the money that Walt invested. So he kind of had his interest peaked there. And then he was the director of opening and closing ceremonies for the 1960 Olympics in Squaw Valley. And there's another little interview you can find from PBS where Bob Hicks, who would eventually become the project manager for Mineral King, where he said Walt turned to someone in Squaw Valley and said, well, I can build a better ski resort than this. So, I mean, you can see whether or not you believe Bob or not on that one, but I can envision that.
Right. You can almost picture Walt Disney saying and believing something like that because he was always looking ahead. He would find a place and automatically start to think what he would be able to do with it and what he would be able to do to enhance it, whether it was Disneyland or somewhere else.
Well, and you see that with a lot of these projects, that it starts out as something kind of contained, and then his ideas just grow and grow and grow and grow until the city's almost like, whoa, hold back.
Right. So, and this really does start in the early 60s. He said I know Walt said in an interview around 1964, 65 or so, is that he says, when I saw Mineral King, 5 or so years ago, I thought it was one of the most beautiful spots I had ever seen, and didn't go on to say, so I think we should develop it. He said, I want to make sure we keep it that way. And he wanted to make this world-class resort there while still keeping it unique and still preserving. Walt was very much a naturalist. He wanted to very much keep that part of the Sequoia National Park. It's sort of the Mineral King is sort of this glacial valley in the southern part of the park. He wanted to keep it beautiful, but also make it something that was going to be more of an attractor and attractive and attraction to guests that might not have come there in the past. And it was going to be something that was not just going to be a theme park like Disneyland, but it really was going to be a year-round vacation destination.
Right. I mean, at one point, they thought it was going to, some ideas had one hotel, had multiple hotels. There was going to be skiing, obviously, in the wintertime, ice rinks. And then summertime, they're going to have tennis courts, pools, a golf course, and then multiple restaurants, one of which was where they had the original idea for the Country Bears.
Yeah, and as Walt started to, like you said, had started to sort of have the idea grow from, and what I love about this too is it came from something that Walt personally enjoyed. He enjoyed skiing, enjoyed spending time with his family. One of my favorite quotes from Walt is, "A man should never neglect his family for business," and it was something that he did with his family, and he wanted to have this American alpine wonderland with this 1,000-room hotel and a movie theater and a general store and ice rinks and pools and tennis courts and a golf course and a hospital and a gas station and a conference center and a power station and a heliport. And at one point, he had ideas for like 22 ski lifts and gondolas, which is interesting with the Skyway. I keep calling it the Skyway. The Skyliner coming to Walt Disney World. He had Bob Gurr design this high-capacity ski lift. And so there was a lot that he wanted to do beyond just the mountain itself being the entertainment attraction. Like you said, he had Mark Davis design a show with these audio animatronic bears that, as we know, would eventually be repurposed and redesigned and become the Country Bear Jamboree in Walt Disney World. And there was a contract in place. This was something this was not just a blue sky idea written down on the back of a napkin. This was a $35 million property and proposal where contracts were signed, but as with many of the things we're going to talk about today, not only did plans change, but for a wide variety of reasons, this idea for not a theme park destination, but a place where guests would be outside hiking and fishing and horseback riding and swimming and having, this true sense of edutainment like we got with Epcot Center. Not only did it change, but unfortunately, things did not necessarily work out exactly as they planned.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because looking into this, I learned a little bit about national parks versus national forest and why Mineral King even existed where it was. I mean, it was almost entirely surrounded by the Sequoia National Park, but there was just that tiny little bit at the southern end and an access road there. And because they thought that there was still potential to mine there, that was never enveloped into the national park. And there was a lot of debate back then between two different sides of how do you best appreciate an area like this? Like, do you do like what Walt said, where you make it accessible to people where they can come in and enjoy what this is? Or the other side kind of felt like, if you invite that many people in, how much risk is there that you're doing damage to this area? And one of the things that this whole project was going to require was a better road. And part of that road was going to have to go through the Sequoia National Park. And that immediately put up red flags for the Sierra Club and other environmental groups. And really, I mean, Walt was an environmentalist this whole time. He was a member of the of the Sierra Club. And even that persona couldn't, his assurances that he was going to keep this, the beautiful place, the pristine place, that the cars were going to be held at the edges and they were going to take all the environmental factors into account. It just really couldn't put those fears at bay for most of the people that lived in that area.
And to be clear, Walt was not the only visionary that had an idea for building something here. Janet Leigh's husband, Robert Brandt, had an entire mountain community planned here, which was going to be a city with a hotel and apartments and shopping and, again, the ski lift and all this kind of thing before Disney acquired the property. And there was actually a press conference at Mineral King in Now, the timing is important. On September 19th, 1966, to announce the specific plans for the resort. The California governor was there, who supported the project and very much believed in what they wanted to do. They were talking about the funding of said roadway. But again, this is just about 2 months before Walt Disney passes. And I don't necessarily think that Walt's passing is the reason why it wasn't built. I think that you're right. I think the legal issues that came up very, very quickly is really what killed it. So Disney originally wanted the resort to open around 1972. They later adjusted those dates to 1976 because in mid-1969, the Sierra Club filed a federal lawsuit fearing that Disney's building here was going to negatively impact the environment. And like you said, that roadway was not going to be in keeping with not just the policies, but the spirit of that. And even though the Supreme Court rejected the suit in 1972, they filed an amended suit, and eventually it continued on for years, and the Mineral King was annexed to Sequoia National Park in the late 70s. And at that point, I think so much time and probably so much money and maybe even interest had been spent that Disney abandoned the project. And there have been talks that over the years, something similar, every now and then kind of comes up again in terms of conversation. But that section of the valley now is part of the Sequoia National Park. So they could never actually build there again. But I think it's just intriguing, the idea of a Disney, I have this song for Beautiful Mount Airy Lodge because I grew up in the Northeast playing in my head. I sort of think about, going up to the Poconos. It's almost the same type of thing, that sort of not just winter, but even summer escape that was not centered around Disney characters and attractions and dinners with princesses.
Yeah. And really, I mean, I also found years later, the Sierra Club tried to help Disney actually potentially move this idea to private property near Independence Lake, which is kind of northwest of Lake Tahoe. But you get the feel that this was kind of really Walt's baby. And when he passed away, and then there's the whole legal issues with the original, obviously, but with him gone and Roy gone, that connection to the original idea and everything, I think it just kind of was easy to let it go, especially with other things that were going on in the 70s, because you have, Disney World and Tokyo Disney, and they've got their hands in other pies by that point, that maybe this one just didn't feel as important anymore.
And there's a part of me that is so interested in Mineral King, not just because of what it was and where it was, but this would have been Disney's first and probably not last foray into building something domestically that was not centered around a tourist destination based on theme parks and IP. And I think, too, from a sentimental point of view, I think it would have been a wonderful testament to Walt's vision and his creativity, and yes, even in environmentality, in building something like that there, especially, again, like I said, because of where it was and the reason why he wanted to build it.
Yeah, I mean, without being part of the company, it's hard to know, but you do kind of wonder, did this impact them when they went to do places like Vero Beach or Hilton Head or Aulani? Because they all have kind of that similar feeling, very little actual Disney animated character presence, if any at all, and a lot of focus on the land where they sit, on the people that surround that land, the location.
Yeah, and I think the conversation is interesting, because I don't think this is sort of a who's right or who's wrong in terms of the different sides. It was not just the Disney Corporation versus all of the environmental groups. I mean, the U.S. Forest Service, thought this was a great opportunity to bring in more tourists for outdoor recreation in California, and I think could have served as a way to demonstrate that you can have these type of facilities living in concert with the environment without actually having to destroy it. I think the conservationists felt that Mineral King, the location itself might not have been ideal for that type of facilities, maybe because it was too large, it was just too grandiose, it would have spoiled some of the wilderness too much. But I'm not sure that they were necessarily against the idea of something like this coming, it just having to be the right size in the right place at the right time, and sort of finding the ideal compromise. But without Walt and without his vision, I think that's probably why the conversation stalled and eventually just faded away.
Right.
But yeah, this is one of many that is definitely going to be, and I'm not even sure how I'm going to answer the question that once we get through these, of which one of the ones I think I would have liked to have seen built. There was one, and again, going in no particular order, there was another one that I think a lot of people know about, and we actually talked about recently on the show, back on the first Finding Florida episode 553, where St. Louis, when we were talking about sort of the expansion, what was going to come after Disneyland, which was what made you sort of think about this next. Mineral King would have been next, but this idea of building the next Disneyland, the next park in America, a lot of eyes and attention and memories will go to this St. Louis Riverfront Square, which was not going to be a copy of Disneyland. Again, we talked about this a little bit on the show, but it was going to be a presence for Disney in this part of the country. It was also going to be one that was going to honor not just the history of St. Louis, but really all of Missouri as well.
Yeah, I mean, as someone from the Midwest, I have to be a cheerleader for the for the Riverfront Square, because this would have been, easy day trip. Yeah, I think the original origins background of Riverfront Square are really interesting. I mean, everybody knows St. Louis for the St. Louis Arch, And if you had asked me how long the St. Louis Arch had been there, I would have been like, oh, that thing's probably like 100 years old. Clearly, I have no concept of what it takes to build one of these things. But it's not that old. And they were building the Gateway Arch and they were building Busch Stadium. And the mayor wanted to add in a video about St. Louis and the history. And he kind of thought, well, we have a really famous guy that we know of that kind of calls Missouri home, and maybe we can get him to make a film for us. So they started campaigning hard to get Walt to make this film that they were hoping was going to be like a circle vision type experience there nearby Busch Stadium and the Gateway Arch. And it was going to be contained in this area called the Riverfront Square, where there'd be mall and retail options and dining, kind of think like really old school Disney Springs. And so they approach Walt with it, and he says, yeah, this sounds interesting. I'm going to have my guy work up a feasibility study and we'll look into it. And if it sounds profitable, maybe we'll even send some people from WED down there to kind of give you some pointers on some other things you can do. So it starts out, it's not a whole theme park. It's just Walt, trying to help out his home state of Missouri with a project. And this was an area that I guess prior to them working on the arch and the stadium, that just was not a great area of St. Louis. And they kind of had this whole revitalization project going on, and it just seemed like a really good opportunity.
And it would have been, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, it would have been something like you said, it's not another theme park. I mean, for one, it would be completely indoors. And I think when people hear St. Louis, sometimes they forget about this is not something that's going to have all these outdoor roller coasters and things like that. But there would have been, a cover at almost, and if you've ever been out, and I haven't been in years, but if you've ever been out to Las Vegas and I assume Caesar's Palace still has this. I remember the interior of Caesar's Palace was this covered sort of shopping arcade that had a ceiling sort of painted to look like the sky, and it would change from day to night. Not that they wanted you to know what time it was outside, but it would change from day to night. And that's almost sort of how I imagined this to be. And it was interesting because just a year or so ago, from what I understand, the only actual plans and blueprints were sold at auction. And you really get a sense of what this space was going to look like with these sort of giant escalators in between a ground level and a top floor level, and a wide variety of different attractions inside.
Yeah, this building was a monster. I mean, by the time Walt goes down and sees the area and kind of commits, like, yeah, I want to do something here. I want to do something more than just this film for you. And he kind of starts to have his, the WED at the time, the Imagineers, work on all these ideas. And the building was going to be not just a full city block, but then it changed into being a super block. Another case of, Walt just making grander and grander ideas. And they even were going to go so far down underground with a giant basement. And the building was going to be 4 to 5 stories. There were actually going to be water rides contained within this, and a giant steam paddle boat. I mean, massive scale of construction.
And I think it touched on a lot of the things that, we keep talking about things that are personal to Walt. Walt he loved America. This was, his part of the country. There's that quote from Walt, that's if you could see inside his eyes, you'd see the flag waving in red, white, and blue. But there was a Lewis and Clark adventure. There was a Mike Fink ride, and you remember the Mike Fink keelboats here from Walt Disney World, and New Orleans Square, a Davy Crockett, an attraction based on the Merrimack Caverns of Missouri, as well as things that we did see in Disneyland, some dark rides like Peter Pan and Snow White and Pinocchio. So there still would be those Disney touches and Disney elements in there, but it really was about where this was and what it was meant to celebrate.
Right. I mean, the whole building was going to kind of be split in two, and there'd be this diorama of the Mississippi River, and the one half of the building was going to focus on St. Louis of yesterday and today, and then the other half of the building would have been all New Orleans, which this is all kind of happening at the same time as the 1964 World's Fair. And Walt had gone there and seen some of the other pavilions that were going to be there ahead of time. And one of them was a New Orleans pavilion. And that's kind of what spurred his interest on attaching this idea of the Mississippi and exploration south into even clear down to where they would have had this bayou boat ride. And then they also wanted to have a walk through pirates attraction, and then those kind of started to come together, and we see almost the beginnings of Pirates of the Caribbean here in St. Louis, even prior to when it would have existed, or maybe they were kind of thinking at the same time for both St. Louis and Disneyland.
And when you start to hear this, you get excited. Even now in 2019, I'm like, this sounds like a great idea. This would almost be something that would make me probably not get in the car, but get into a plane and go to see it. And it's one that continues to this day to be surrounded by rumor and myth, and I think a little bit of misinformation in terms of why it was never built. It's something, again, we talked about in the Finding Florida. There's this rumor, this ongoing rumor that the only reason why it wasn't built was because August Busch wanted Disney to sell alcohol in the parks. Walt said, I'm never selling alcohol in the parks. Hello, Fantasyland and Magic Kingdom. Those are all not really true at all. I mean, for a lot of these things that never come to pass, a lot of times it's not something so dramatic, but it comes down to just dollars and cents. And, Disney wanted to go forward with it, but it was the city who wanted Disney really, for all intents and purposes, to kind of pay for it all themselves.
Yeah, the alcohol issue, I think it's kind of interesting where that comes from, because Admiral Joe Fowler, we all know his work that he did in Disney World, and he, I guess, is kind of the originator of this story, because he said he was sitting there and he heard August Busch look at Walt and tell him, a park that doesn't sell alcohol in St. Louis is never going to work. It's going to be a failure. And he said Walt left and got on the plane and we never went back. And maybe Joe Fowler never did go back, but Walt did go back, and he actually came up with a solution and a compromise in that there was going to be a cocktail lounge up on the roof of this building, a restaurant, a cocktail lounge, and it would have views of the arch, and there would have been elevators that serviced just that lounge. So people could have gone through to get to where the alcohol was, or if you were in the amusement area, you could have had your hand stamp to go up there, and then that would have taken care of the issue where Walt had always said there would never be alcohol in his park. And
right.
So there was no issue with August Busch. I guess from what I read, he still was trying to get Walt to partner with him to do some things at a location that he owned in Texas years later. And so, yeah, it really just came down to the money that the city was willing to spend versus Walt. They kind of thought that Walt thought that they were going to give him a turnkey ready building like you hear on houses now. And the city kind of thought, no, we're just going to give you the shell of a building. And it looks like there was about a $9 million difference, which in today's dollars, it's like, come on, $9 million, just give me a St. Louis park. But, back then that was a good chunk of money, especially when they're looking at other projects they're wanting to do. And that was really just the biggest barrier.
Yeah. And as you were talking, you said the magic word or the magic state that comes up over and over and over again. I would say a year doesn't go by. Usually a couple of months don't go by before I get the email going, hey, Lou, just want to let you know it's on the DL, but I live in blank, Texas, and Disney's buying up all this property. So get ready for the big announcement, because Texas is going to be the location of the next Disney theme park. We sort of, giggle and joke about it now, except the people in Texas are like, no, Mangello, I'm serious. Disney's coming here. This was not the first, nor shall it be the last rumor of a Disney park going to, and we'll talk about other sort of urban locations, but Texas has been one that has been on not just the rumor circuit for years, but it's actually one of the ones that Disney seriously considered a long time ago.
Are you talking about San Antonio or Dallas?
I was talking about that. I just want to say Texposition.
Yes. Yeah. The San Antonio one's kind of a mystery to me. I'm not sure where people get that. That's probably one of those emails you get, but it is out there. But yeah, Texposition and the other urban areas that kind of go along with that at the same time. But yeah, there's some very interesting things that would have been located there. If you look up the overhead art of that, it's kind of, I don't think you can really call it a blueprint, but kind of concept art. But yeah, it was supposed to be like a festival marketplace. So this combination of, again, like Riverfront, retail and dining, and then that would have kind of been on the perimeter. And then in the interior, there would have been all of the interesting attraction stuff. But yeah, that overhead includes a couple of familiar names. I noticed one of them is mannequins, and it almost has what looks like turntables drawn on it, like mannequins had. And then there also was an adventure club.
Yeah, so Texposition is another one of these that I think is not a name that people hear a lot about. And if they have, nor do they realize just how much Disney looked into this and was serious about it. So Disney hired Harrison Buzz Price, and you may or may not know that name. You've probably seen it on a window here and there. He was one who did a lot of the feasibility studies. He literally picks the spot for places like Disneyland. And in the late 80s, he was looking for, like you said, this massive festival themed marketplace mall that was going to be, we sort of keep coming back to downtown Disney and Pleasure Island and Disney Springs. It was going to be this high-end shopping mall with, anchor department stores, but there would also be some rides and other different entertainment venues and experiences for guests as well as fine dining. And when you start to say that out loud, you're like, Mangello, that sounds a lot like Disney Springs. It absolutely does sound like Disney Springs, although there were going to be attractions, or at least one attraction that they were looking at was this theater-based flight simulator based on the original sort of Star Tours model and concept. And what Disney felt was having a ride there would bring sort of that Disney touch, that cutting edge technological aspect to the park. And although we know that they can do it here, we haven't really seen them do that yet. It's one that allows them to easily swap out the theme for as time goes on. So it could have changed from Star Tours to Wall-E to whatever they wanted it to be. This way, there's a re-rideability factor for not just guests who are coming from out of state, but I think this is one that was really targeted towards the local customer base itself. And they felt that, 4.5 million people lived within 100 miles of Dallas alone. So those were going to be the people that they really wanted to, I don't want to say be the main attractors for, because there obviously were outside guests and people who come into Dallas for conventions and otherwise. But this was going to be, and I've only seen one sort of 3/4 look down sketch of what it would look like, but it was a pretty substantial piece of property located in what's known as the Turtle Creek area of Dallas, just off the I-78, which Disney felt was, well, they called it a upscale entertainment area for the local market.
Yeah, the pictures I've seen are actually from an article about the gentleman that Disney was partnering with to do this. His name was Jim Rouse. And at the same time, they were looking at Chicago's Navy Pier, too. So again, like knife to the heart for all of us Midwesterners. But that article presents a couple really interesting things when it comes to these more urban environments that, like you said, they were looking more for locals. Like Eisner even mentions with regards to these that these were not a replacement for Disneyland or Disney World. They did not expect someone to plan their whole vacation around one of these places. So they had to constantly be offering something that was new to those locals. So that was one of the biggest barriers that Jim Rouse and Disney faced, was how do we keep this new and fresh? And that's going to be a constant cost. And when it's not a park, do you have a gate entry fee? Because Mr. Rouse was more involved with the retail side. And from his vantage point, you don't want a gate fee for people who you are hoping are going to come in and buy merchandise at this location. And from Disney's standpoint, that was all they knew at that time, was you charge a gate fee, and that's how we cover what we're giving you. And so they ran into that problem. They also ran into an interesting problem that I would have not thought about. And that's that in an urban area like this, there is no berm. Mm-hmm. So if you're building like the Chicago Navy Pier example, you have to finish these buildings on all four sides versus, you look at Google Earth like we do, and you have these buildings that have very small facades compared to the size of their show building. So that was just a huge cost barrier. And ultimately, Mr. Rouse backed away because he knew it just didn't jive up with what he usually did, which was these, big retail heavy areas.
Yeah, but like I said, this is still a rumor that comes up a lot. I actually remember years ago, and so I'm trying to do the math. I mean, I guess it was close to 10 years ago. There was a huge Disney press event, a huge media event in Disney, where they were being very mysterious and cryptic about these very exciting, huge plans. They were going to live, they were going to live webcast it and all that kind of stuff like that. So the conversation about Texas, this is it. This is when the announcement for Texas is going to come up. Every time there's some sort of, mystery Disney announcement about, the yearly promotion or whatever it might be, the idea for, and I'm wondering how many people sometimes, the people that speculate, have gone and bought land in the middle of nowhere, Texas, sure that this was going to be the next big land grab like Lake Buena Vista in Florida, and they were going to make 100 times their investment. But I still don't know that, of the 25 or so different Texas cities and towns that we have heard about, that Texas will ever be a likely destination for a third theme park or destination resort.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if it were in Texas, I think the idea of something like this has a greater probability of working today than it did back in the 80s, just because we already have the proven example of Disney Springs, that Disney is able to do something like this. Whether or not they would be able to translate that to a city that's away from an already established park, I don't know. I mean, you have the example of Disney Quest that clearly, like the Disney Quest in Chicago, didn't last that long. But that was solely a gated, ticketed experience. If they built some type of larger complex with that, would it have worked? If it was more than just the interactive games, it might have appealed to more like a broader audience range. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and not to jump ahead, but I still, I don't think Disney is done domestically. Look, I know it's not necessarily continental United States, but, Aulani works really, really well. Like, if you've never been to Aulani, you need to go to Aulani. I don't necessarily think that that's the final resort of its kind or destination of that kind. But yeah, I'm not sure that Texas would be the ideal spot, because you do potentially cannibalize some of the audiences from both the West Coast and the East Coast by being kind of right in the middle of that. So, and now all the people from Branson, Missouri are going, this is where it's coming. We know that Disney's coming here too. That's another one of the rumors that keeps on coming back.
It is kind of an interesting question, though. I mean, even from listeners, like, would you do something like this in lieu of a Disney vacation? I mean, this would not be a replacement for me for a trip to Disney World.
Right.
But maybe on a year when I can't afford it, would I spend some of my money going somewhere like this? You know, how far would you be willing to travel to get to something like this? I mean, I think that kind of informs over whether or not it could be a success, because maybe it wouldn't really be cannibalizing from California or Orlando because maybe people wouldn't view it that way. Well, or maybe they just wouldn't want to spend this money in addition to it. I don't know. So
let's sort of take that cannibalization of an audience and use that as, I'm trying to create a segue from there in terms of another planned location, not even rumored, a planned location for what was going to be another Disney, I'm using air quotes, park, property, marina, port, not all that far from Disneyland. And I'm talking about Port Disney in Long Beach, California.
Yeah, Port Disney. And it's almost hard to talk about Port Disney without also addressing WESTCot.
Right.
We'll get to that later.
Yeah,
they kind of go together.
Yeah.
They kind of almost cannibalize on each other. But yeah, Port Disney was the Eisner era. And this was going to be an area in Long Beach. And you almost have to go back just a little ways back to if anyone recognizes the name Jack Rather and Rather Corp. And this was the gentleman that Walt partnered with in order to build the Disneyland Hotel. And as part of that, Jack Rather and his company would then be the exclusive supplier, or have the exclusive rights to build these Disney hotels. Well, Michael Eisner comes on board, and he very much was into the idea of expanding and building more hotels. Clearly, he was, the instigator for that in Disney World. He wanted to do the same thing in Disneyland and was not able to. Well, not to be disrespectful, but as fortune would have it, Mr. Rather passes away and Disney purchases the Rather Corp. And as part of that, they get this land lease option in Long Beach. And if you've ever been to Long Beach, that's the home of the Queen Mary and the cruise ship. And then at that point in time, it was also home to the Spruce Goose, which was Howard Hughes' wooden plane. And these were the two attractions that sat there on Long Beach. And Michael Eisner was really looking at a way that they could develop this. And it was going to kind of have two sides to it on the north and south end of Queensway Bay. And the north side would have been the city side, where there would have been a Tidelands Hotel, Shoreline Hotel, a Shoreline Aquatic Park, a Marina Hotel, and then a retail entertainment center, kind of like what we were talking about with Texposition. And then on the port side, or it would have been called the port side, and that would have been the south side of the bay, there was going to be a cruise ship port, not necessarily for the Disney Cruise Line because that didn't exist yet, but for other cruise ships coming in. And then two more hotels, one called the Port Hotel and then the Canal Hotel. And then the big ticket was going to be Disney Sea, which again, these are breaking my heart because I remember I'm not going to give my age, but I remember being a little kid when the concept art came out for Tokyo Disney Sea. And I remember flipping through that Disney magazine so many times, looking in wonder and awe at that concept art. So the idea that there could have been a Disney Sea in the US, because it's not likely I'm ever going to make my way to Japan, that I could have seen that, it just seems like a real loss. And especially when you look at the concept art for this place. I mean, the big weenie would have been these giant bubbles that inside of there would have been, at that point in time, the world's largest aquarium, along with several other attractions. And then beyond that, other areas like Mysterious Island, a Heroes Harbor with a Sinbad attraction, and an aqua labyrinth maze with walls made out of water. I don't know how you do that, but it sounds incredible. And then Venture Reefs, where there would have been like snorkeling, and somehow they got past the Disney lawyers the idea of putting guests in cages to swim with sharks. And then also
go wrong?
a Boardwalk Rainbow Pier, which kind of sounds a lot like what Paradise Pier and then now Pixar Pier eventually became.
Well, and if you think about this too, let's sort of put it in context and frame it in terms of time. This is 1990, right? Middle of 1990. So we referenced, not going to be the first or the last time we reference the Disney decade with Michael Eisner. And they've got, nearly 450 acres to put something that is akin but very much unlike Mineral King, because it's not just this marine-themed amusement park. So again, Disney is thinking about the environment and exactly where they are, but this marina and a cruise ship port before they actually get into the cruise ship business a number of years later, a huge retail and entertainment area, which really, and if you look at the maps of this of Queensway Bay at the mouth of the Los Angeles River, you really get a sense of them sort of owning this almost aquatic cul-de-sac of land and sea, as it were. But this was not just something that was on the internal Disney drawing boards. They actually published a single, one and only, Port Disney News in 1991 that they distributed to people who lived in the Long Beach area in order to, I guess, generate excitement and maybe do a little bit of, surveying in terms of reaction. I'll read you just a little bit of what it said. Welcome to Disney Sea. Here you will experience a thrilling journey through the mysteries, challenges, and natural wonders of the sea. Among the highlights of your trip will be an intimate encounter with our planet's most important environmental resource and the chance to participate in exciting research activities conducted by some of the leading oceanic scientists. That sounds like a little bit of Tokyo Disney Sea and a whole lot of the seas with Nemo and friends. They talk about these fantastic voyages possibly becoming reality based on this conceptual master plan so that everybody can experience these marvels of nature's secret world beneath the sea and get firsthand experience of how the oceans affect human life as well as the life of the planet. So there is absolutely an educational, an environmental component to this, which I think is something that Disney wanted to do. And I think because of where and when and what they were building, I think they needed to do that as well. So it didn't just feel maybe like it did up in the Sequoias, like Disney was coming in to build a theme park in this area where nature and the water is so very important.
Yeah, and actually there were some rules on the books there too, that the Coastal Commission required that they had public access to the beach there. I mean, this was all part of an initiative to try to make the port and the beach more accessible, more inviting, get people out there and experiencing, like you said, experiencing the ocean, that this is, one of the greatest resources that we have, that it's something that, I mean, even still today, there's a lot we don't know about it. And for a lot of people, it was very uncharted. And yeah, there definitely was an educational aspect to this place. I mean, there very much was the Disney Sea, would have had a Nemo's Land Cruiser and the City of Atlantis e-ticket ride and things like that. But there also was this research center that sounds, a lot like what the Living Seas was originally. These people doing, rehabilitation for sea life. And they even mentioned that it would have had like the largest library, collection of information for people to come there from, researchers all over the world to come there and study.
And every paragraph and almost every sentence of that newsletter talked about the educational aspect. So it's our vision for Long Beach to be a singular blend of entertainment and education through Disney-style rides and attractions, marine research facilities, an oceanarium, and other aquatic adventures. They want to sensitize millions of visitors to the enormous challenges and opportunities of our seas, our most precious resource, in a setting that encourages play and fantasy. They want guests to wonder about it, to ask questions, and have a memorable time. So they also went on to talk about exploring the myths and the romance and the challenges and the mysteries of the ocean. So this idea of breaking down the barriers between guests and the sea while making it truly entertainmental, it's entertaining and educational all at the same time, again, which, you know, we hear that, we start to think about Epcot, was a wonderful mix of fantasy in terms of, okay, maybe that, you know, maybe the shark cage encounter may have been a little bit, but this idea of Mysterious Island and Pirate Island, it screams Disney, it feels Disney, but it's also something that was very different than Disneyland.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. That's kind of a pattern you'll see in this, and I think probably the next two that we're going to talk about. And I don't know if this was something that Michael Eisner pushed specifically during that era, or if that was something that Imagineers really wanted, but there's very much a sense here and a couple of the others of wanting to offer the edutainment aspect.
Yeah, and a lot of times why these projects don't get built, I mean, there are recurring themes, right, in terms of environmental issues, traffic issues, employment issues, but a lot of times it also comes down to money, and the estimated cost for the Port Disney Resort was supposedly in the $3 billion range. I mean, this was not going to be any small undertaking by any stretch of the imagination, but there was local opposition, which I think ended up being a big part of the reason why, because that $3 billion number goes up exponentially when the city and the area and maybe the environmental groups are opposed to what you're doing. You see how it could not only delay but cause a huge financial impact on it. So it's late the next year that they cancel the plans for Port Disney, but wait, don't worry, we've got something else on the horizon.
Yeah, like I said, you can't really talk about Port Disney without talking about WESTCot. I mean, there's a lot of people who think, researching it, I'm not inclined to think this really, but there's a lot of people who claim that Port Disney wasn't really even something they were ever going to do. That it was just, well, we're going to pretend like we're interested in this over here to try to get Anaheim to agree to what we really want to do over there. But I don't think you put that much effort into designing something if you never had any intention of ever building Port Disney. I mean, I think they really had some intention there. And I think clearly they liked what they did because they took it over to Tokyo and implemented a lot of it.
And I don't want to rub salt or Tabasco sauce in your wound, but if you've listened to me talk about Disney Sea in the past, it is far away the most spectacular Disney park that I have ever. I mean, Walt Disney World is near and dear to my heart, and it's the place that I call home, but there's nothing close. And having seen what some of the ideas for the Disney Sea theme park in Port Disney would have been, with those Heroes Harbor and the Grecian Village and this Asian water market and the Venture Reefs, only got me more excited for what was eventually never built. But we've got to find a way to get you over to Tokyo at some point.
I do understand that they do have like a Queen Mary looking cruise ship in Tokyo Disney Sea though, right?
They do.
In the American Harbor. Yeah. So I think that's kind of cool that they took, what was there in the original port and transplanted it over. But yeah, back to WESTCot. Again, Michael Eisner wanted to expand, wanted additional hotels. And so they've got this area that they're looking at across from Disneyland. And the idea was to build WESTCot, a riff off of Epcot. I kind of feel like they could have come up with a better name than that. I don't know. I mean, Epcot's, I mean, it's not the word. It's experimental prototype, you know, I mean, there's a purpose for all those letters. WESTCot is just like, well, let's just take that EP off and throw something else on the front. But yeah, they were going to try to build this park after the success of Tokyo Disneyland and after Disney MGM Studios. And their catchphrase for it was the 7 wonders of WESTCot. And 4 of those wonders would have been more comparable to the World Showcase side of Epcot. And then 3 of them would have been comparable to the Future World section. So in the where you would have entered would have been the Americas or the New World. And that was so that it visually complemented the entrance to Disneyland. You would have had this old turn of the century look of the US Main Street section there at the front that would have complemented nicely when you looked either way, from the entrance to Disneyland or the entrance to WESTCot. And there you would have had an updated American adventure, a Native American show, you know, an indoor fiesta for Mexico, kind of makes you think of the Mexican pavilion at Epcot. And then an Aztec Incan show about some of the legends of South America. And moving on, you would have had, you know, additional attractions and areas for each of those other world sections. So the next section flanking the US would have been Europe, and that would have had a circle vision called From Time to Time, which eventually was put in place in Paris and then eventually moved to Disney World. So From Time to Time is another name for timekeeper that we ended up with here. It would have had a Trans-European Railroad, a Russia show that they never implemented at Epcot when the Russian pavilion was never built. Then you would have had another world section that would have been Asia, there actually would have been a hotel there, an Indian Palace hotel. So it would have been one of these first instances of you being able to, you know, spend the night and immediately enter the park. A carousel with mythic Asian animals, the big e-ticket for WESTCot, Ride the Dragon, would have been a Chinese Great Wall roller coaster over the Dragon's Teeth Mountain. And then moving on, you would have had World of Africa, would have been the 4th section in the World Showcase type area. And this one kills me. Michael Eisner really bad wanted for this section, because this Africa was originally supposed to represent Africa and the Mideast. He wanted a 3 religions of the world attraction. And this just sounds fraught with issues from the beginning. But they kind of came to this conclusion that, you know, the 3 major religions all agree on the 7 days of creation. And they went so far as to have 7 different artists who were going to kind of depict each day of creation. And they were going to, I don't know if this was going to be a ride through attraction or how this was going to work, but it sounds interesting. But I guess they quickly decided this probably wasn't a good idea. But that was going to be the world section of those 7 wonders. So those 4 wonders.
And everything about that excites me, right? And as much as I love Epcot Center here, I think this was going to be, it was not going to be a carbon copy of what we have here. It was going to be different in a lot of ways. First and foremost, it was going to transform what was at the time a parking lot into an expansion of Disneyland. So now Disneyland, unlike Florida, would become a multi-day destination, right? Because what was happening was people were going to Disneyland for the day and then going other places in Southern California. Disney obviously wants to keep the guests and their pocketbooks in and around Disneyland as much as possible. So that's why this idea, and I love the idea of the hotel inside the theme park. The other thing that really was of interest to me too was this world cruise, right? A cruise around the World Showcase that was sort of an amalgam of wandering the promenade and World Showcase with the historical elements of meeting and communicating with each other from Spaceship Earth, and a little bit of world emotion and a little bit of so it took sort of elements from all of those different attractions and brought in not just sort of a boat ride past or through pavilions, but there would have been scenes and audio animatronics of Leonardo da Vinci and the Mona Lisa, Mona Lisa, the burning of Rome, the Sistine Chapel. And the thing that made this different was it was not sort of a grand circle tour around the world. It would allow guests to embark or disembark at different docks throughout each of the different lands. So it almost sounds like what was the old water taxi in Animal Kingdom that never really worked well. And
the
people
Discovery
didn't know,
River boats.
Right?
Yes.
Nobody really knew what it was supposed to do, but I think if they would have positioned this correctly, the idea of, getting on in Japan and getting off over by, and this is the thing that I would have loved to have seen as part of the first expansion, a huge Egyptian palace. I've been waiting for Egypt to come to Epcot forever. And an additional hotel. This would have been something similar to Epcot's World Showcase, but I think unique in its own right.
Yeah, and I guess that cruise would have lasted 45 minutes if you did the whole entire thing. So, yeah, that sounded incredible, that alone. But yeah, this sounds like they took like all the best pieces of Epcot and then whatever they couldn't fit in, they stuck in a shaker and like threw it on the world cruise.
Right. But and there was other, something else if you read through some of the original plans and marketing materials for it, because they did announce that this was coming, was there was going to be a little section of Tivoli Gardens, which I liked because it a lot of people maybe don't realize that little Danish park really was one of the other things that helped influence Walt and his idea for creating Disneyland. So I think that was not just a tribute to the park itself, but a little bit of a tribute to Walt as well. And there's also going to be a train ride too, a trans world or trans-European train ride through the park too.
Yeah, and one of the things I thought was interesting in the Africa section was they were going to have this giant African art exhibit that was owned by Tishman. And at that point in time, it was being housed in another museum, but then they were going to permanently move it here to WESTCot, and it was going to be the largest collection of that in the world. So again, that whole edutainment aspect is very present here also. And,
you were talking about the three religion concept. There was also in that Africa, Middle East area that they were going to be sort of putting together, there was going to, and I have to imagine it would almost be a little bit more of a thrill ride, because it was supposed to be a whitewater raft ride down the fictional Congo-Beezy River. It sounds like one of those fake names you hear like made up on Match Game PM, right? It's the Congo-Beezy River, and there was also going to be an exhibit on farming culture, which, like Epcot, also makes me feel that they have not forgotten not just about the cultural aspects of what WESTCot was going to be, but the educational opportunities that would be present therein.
Right. And then beyond this area, there, this is going to have the lagoon, like what you have there at Epcot, but then there was going to be, in original plans, this giant gold 300-foot sphere in place of Spaceship Earth, and it was going to be called Space Station Earth. And then kind of later on, they decided, okay, maybe 300 feet is a little excessive. And so they kind of were debating about what they would do for that central piece. But there would have been a big waterfall inside there and a lobby that would have led you on to Ventureport, which would have then led to the three wonders of what would have been like Future World. And this, there's a little bit less information on, at least from what I could find, than the World Showcase similar side. Mm-hmm. But we do know that they were going to be the wonders of Earth or nature, wonders of living, and then wonders of space. And on wonders of living, you get a lot of the wonders of life basically being lifted up, transplanted to wonders of living. But let's not bury the lead here. You get Journey into Imagination and not the original, like a companion to.
Right. So right now you have to go and visit both, right? Because
yes.
And it's interesting too, because what they were trying to do and where they were doing it also raised, we get excited when we hear about what was coming. We're like, yeah, come on, man, just do it. I'll pay for it. I'll go. You start to think of the numbers, right? And again, we're back up into the $3 billion plus range, which is fine. You think, it's probably a number that they could make back. But they were speculating in terms of the number of visitors that this would potentially, new visitors that this would attract by, the late 90s. Could they financially justify that number? And that was a little bit difficult to do. Plus, I think something else that gets lost in the discussion of WESTCot is the idea that Disney wanted to do kind of what they did here in Florida decades later. So, again, referencing back to the Finding Florida, we're starting to talk about once the property has been decided on, what Disney wants to do in terms of creating its own sort of quasi-government district. But in California, they wanted to create their own special assessment district. So they wanted to get money for improvements to attractions. They wanted to add more hotels. They wanted to do a lot of renovations to the Disneyland Hotel and this new Disneyland Center. They'd create this 5,000-seat Disneyland Bowl to be built outside of the park gates, and a boardwalk with outdoor dining. And there was a lot that was going to have to happen in terms of infrastructure and how it was going to potentially impact not just Disneyland, but the surrounding areas. There's a improvements to infrastructure, especially in a developed area, is no small task, and it is one that absolutely can and will impact the area around it. And I think that is part of one of the reasons why WESTCot doesn't necessarily get much farther in terms of actual planning and design and execution as it does in the excited minds and hearts of Disney fans, who obviously ultimately wanted this not just second park, but this full-fledged resort and entertainment complex to be built. Obviously, ultimately we get, Disney California Adventure and Downtown Disney, but it would have been, WESTCot would have been and done and felt very different than what we have in Disneyland and DCA today.
Right. And I think you have to look at, too, what happened in between them creating this master plan versus when DCA was built. You also have the Euro Disney first year, almost $1 billion loss that first year, where they don't want to say that directly impacted, but there's no way that didn't somewhat impact what projects they were able to take on in the early 90s.
Yeah. And I think it's easy for us to say, $3 billion, what's $3 billion among friends? But you're right. All of these factors affect the ability to do it. So it doesn't take very long too for residents to start to say, hey, wait a minute, like all this expansion, it sounds good. And yes, there's going to be more jobs, but how is it going to affect those of us who are already living here? How's it going to affect our infrastructure? Because of how large WESTCot was going to be in terms of sort of blowing out the berm, as it were, and having these areas that were going to be outside necessarily what already DCA currently looks like, local residents were concerned about what this was going to be in terms of traffic and, pollution and intruding on the residential areas. And with that and the financial problems, again, they sort of officially decide to scrap this idea in the mid-90s. And from what I understand, Eisner basically is like, all right, we need to just sit back, relax, and figure out what we're doing. We're going to Aspen, and he takes 30 executives with him to try and come up with what we're going to do instead of this $3 billion massive expansion of what would have been, Disneyland and WESTCot.
Yeah, and then, obviously they, like you said, they come out with something completely entirely different with DCA, and they discover that, California is the focus we want. And I've never been to DCA, so I can't really judge. I've read a lot about it. I hope to go someday, but I think WESTCot sounded amazing. The whole kind of twist on original Epcot of this, melting pot, civilization. And I also think it's interesting that several times over, when you look at like old presentations on this, that the Imagineers noted that this would have been more child friendly than Epcot, which I think is kind of an interesting position considering so many people today, that's kind of their cry against some of the things that have happened in Epcot. But even back then, they recognized that we need something that's just a little bit more family friendly.
Well, and I think something else that happened too was as time went on, and the conversation of WESTCot continued and continues to come up over and over again. Back in the mid-late 90s, I remember Tony Baxter spoke at a convention and talked a little bit more about what his individual and sort of collective vision was for WESTCot, and started to use words that we're using a lot more now. It was a lot more interactive. It was a lot more participatory. It was not going to be a passive experience where you were just going to watch. As I say the next words coming out of my mouth, think about Galaxy's Edge. You were meant to be part of the story, and the characters and the activities there were meant to interact with you and help you craft your own story. The idea was that you were not just having a vacation in Disneyland and WESTCot, you were living out your dream of going to Asia and staying there, right? You had the hotel, in the Asian section and these European and African sections as well. So it really was meant to be something that you didn't walk into and leave. Think Galaxy's Edge, think the Star Wars Hotel, but it was going to be something that they wanted to be truly experiential.
Yeah, it almost makes you wonder. Because there is very little information on what the Wonders of Space area was going to be. And, have we already seen that? Did that inform on what they did with Mission Space or what they are going to be doing with the Space Restaurant? And they also, like you said, talked about the interactivity. They talked about kids doing these interactive things to find out and learn about what their place in the world was going to be through games, through enjoyment, through edutainment. Are there old plans that are somewhat informing on the new play pavilion and the interactivity of that? Like, are they taking some of WESTCot and shifting some of Epcot toward those ideas?
I would not be all that surprised. I'm treading carefully. I would not be all that surprised if at this year's D23 Expo in Anaheim, California, we do not hear, I would bet dollars to donuts, we're going to hear more about what is coming to Epcot. I would not be surprised if some of the elements directly or indirectly related to WESTCot are things that are going to be part of this Epcot, not just reimagining, but I think expansion. because Epcot is and was, especially World Showcase, was very much sort of this World's Fair type of environment, where WESTCot, everything would be different. And if you look online at some of the concept art for WESTCot, is some of the most beautiful Disney concept art I have ever seen. So you mentioned a Spaceship Earth like globe. I want to put this in context. And again, part of the reason why we had the conversation about people who were residents of the surrounding area, instead of a 180-foot geodesic sphere, it's going to be a 300-foot golden sphere inside this lattice work of metal set on this very lush green island. And there's bridges and waterfalls, and you have to sort of ascend up into the globe to ride what is going to be a very different version or type of attraction than what we have for Spaceship Earth. I keep wanting to call it Space Station Earth. Their Space Station Earth would have been very different than our Spaceship Earth.
Yeah, you mentioned the concept art, and I'm looking at the one right now that's very purple, pink, with the big golden sphere in the middle. And my first impression when I pulled that up, and I'd seen it in the past before, but when I looked at it again, was it was so reminiscent of that concept art that was released, I think, at the last D23 or maybe since then, of what that area behind Spaceship Earth is going to look like in the future. It's that piece that looks very purples and blues and lush, and it just gives you that same type of feel. It just immediately made me think, are they heading kind of in this direction?
And something else that they were going to do too was they really wanted to have as much control over when I say control over your experience, they wanted to be personal to you, but all of the pavilions in Future World would have been indoors, right? They sort of analogous to these giant themed sound stages. And again, Tony Baxter said he wanted you, especially in the World Showcase-ish aspect, they wanted you to be introduced to these cultures, to have less fear and apprehension about becoming part of that world. So there was a Wonders of Earth pavilion that would allow you to go through the jungle, like underwater areas, the Arctic, and the desert, while the Wonders of Living would be focused on the human mind and body. So think Making of Me, Body Wars, Cranium Command sort of in one, and Wonders of Earth almost being that non-futuristic version of the different environments that we would get to see and go through in an attraction like Horizons. Yeah,
they actually mentioned in that Earth area that the frozen tundra type environment, they were going to make snow, like literal snow that you could have snow fights with, or you could ice skate. So yeah, it was very much going to be contained, like you mentioned, controlling the environment so that you could experience these places that you potentially had never, whether it was desert or jungle or right.
They want you to be able to walk into these controlled environments, these individual worlds. Like there's the wonders of space, right? So you sort of, again, this was one of the early ideas for a space-themed pavilion, but the old world and the new world and the world of Asia and the world of Africa, getting you to be able to go in and understand what those are. And I think in a different way than what we have in World Showcase now. You walk through the German pavilion and you can go into the restaurant and you can get a sense of what the architecture might be like and the food might be like and music and cast members. But this would have been something on a much deeper level, I think, in terms of what each of the pavilions was going to be able to provide guests.
Yeah, it sounds more akin to like what you get with Animal Kingdom. With Asia and Africa, where there's a greater depth. You're walking further in, you're experiencing a larger environment than some of the pavilions are larger, but a lot of the pavilions are fairly self-contained, and you're kind of just seeing facades and, retail areas or a restaurant or whatever. These sound like something that you would have traveled further into.
Yeah. And I think as we talk about it, right, I start to get myself more excited, like, God, I would have loved this idea. But I think part of the problem is, we read about this, we think about this, we imagine what it's like in our own little bit of a bubble, forgetting about what was happening on the opposite side in terms of local business owners and neighborhood groups and environmental groups and the city and local governments and some of the issues that they raised, whether it's, economic, environmental, or otherwise, which really is what at first started to shrink down the plans for WESTCot around 92 or so. They took this idea of a Hollywoodland section out of the plan. Then all of a sudden, the issues, like you said, with Euro Disneyland start to have an effect on the project. And claim as you might that they have one has nothing to do with each other. I mean, it's one company, it's one umbrella. And if they see that something new that they have created is hemorrhaging money, like Lee Cockrell said on a show a while back, at $1 million a day, you start to run into funding concerns. And then they tried to get the federal government to pay for parking structures. That fails. There's an additional $250 million. So all these things start to bring about a change in the reality of what WESTCot can be. They start to scale back what the number of hotels is going to be. So the rooms go from, 4,500 rooms to 1,500 rooms. They didn't want to make the same mistakes that were being made in Euro. I keep on calling it Disneyland Paris, Euro Disneyland, and have to start thinking about some of the other issues that are in play at the same time.
Yeah, and then they end up abandoning WESTCot then entirely by 1995. But I do think it's interesting that they have all these struggles, like the financial struggles with Euro Disney and kind of the idea that some of these things are costing too much. But then there was this whole idea that they were potentially going to build Port Disney and build WESTCot. If they weren't pitting them against each other, were they really thinking they could build both of those at the same time? And then throw into the mix the next one we're going to talk about, Disney's America. And, they've got several fronts that they're going to spend money in and fight wars on. And
and the thing that was somewhat surprising to me about WESTCot, and again, the benefit of being able to meet and hear from and see, and I applaud, like D23 and stuff like that. When you get to hear from guys like Marty Sklar years later, and he's like, you know what? I was surprised to hear that Marty Sklar was not necessarily on board with the whole WESTCot idea. He didn't want to look. He sort of was following Walt. You don't follow pigs with pigs. He didn't want to spend, nearly a decade doing something that he felt was already done in Epcot. He thought it was a bit of a cumbersome idea, but what he did feel was that, we're in Southern California and everything here is sort of spread out so very far. Hollywood Boulevard is over here, and then there's, the history of Walt coming from Kansas City. There's all these other California success stories, and maybe what we need to do is bring this idea of California not on a macro level, but on a micro level. And that's part of how the idea for California Adventure comes to be. Look, even John Hench said, supposedly, I obviously wasn't there, but supposedly John Hench, when he saw the plans for WESTCot, he's like, I liked the idea better when it was a parking lot. So,
yeah.
maybe sometimes the enthusiasm gets the best of everybody, but who knows? Some of the ideas, this is of all the things that we're talking about, maybe some of these ideas won't necessarily ever die. So you mentioned what is obviously one of the bigger elephants in the room, and I think it's one that is probably going to be deserving of its own show because of not just how big it was and could have been, but how far along it was and some of the reasons why Disney's America never came to be. So, Kendall, I think a lot of people, they hear the name Disney's America and they're like, yeah, wasn't that the thing they were going to build somewhere on the... Sort of take us back in terms of what and where Disney's America was going to be.
Again, this is the Eisner era, and he kind of went about buying land up the same way that Walt did for Walt Disney World, where they used pseudonyms to secure land options and to purchase land. And where they did that was in Haymarket, Virginia, which is about 5 miles from the Manassas battlefield, and then just a short distance from Washington, D.C. And so because of that, they had this whole idea of building a theme park with the tagline, "Recall the past, live the present." And this would have covered American history from the 1600s to the present then, the 1990s, with different focus areas. I mean, the entrance area would have been the crossroads of the U.S., which would have been kind of an early 19th century. Again, this would have included a hotel where you could have had this whole stay in the park type experience. And then there would have been a President's Square, a Native American area, Civil War fort, an area kind of focused on the Industrial Revolution called Enterprise, Victory Field that would have focused on the World War I and II, State Fair to kind of give you that whole Ferris wheel, Midwest America State Fairground, and Family Farm, and then We the People attraction. In each of these areas had their own, restaurants, attractions, etc., like, a typical Disney park.
And, as you start to go through those different lands, and we'll talk more about what it actually looked like and sort of the train aspect and things that are similar things. When you start to talk about those things, it makes me think that this is an idea that really, although Walt had long passed, it really sort of made me think back to Walt Disney and Disneyland, right? Again, we talked about Walt's personal love of America and his original plans for Disneyland to create that Liberty Street just off sort of Main Street, which would have had those recreations of colonial America and the shops and blacksmiths and silversmiths. And there would have been that Liberty Street, which would have ended up in Liberty Square and Philadelphia and Independence Hall, some elements of which we get here eventually in Walt Disney World, but really sort of expanding on that in Disney's America.
Yeah, and you get the feeling that even though, when you look at their brochure that they actually went all the way to producing for this park, there's no direct comparison to the St. Louis Riverfront, but you kind of get the feeling that it's a lot of what Walt was going for there, that it's the celebration of, America, what it's been through, our history, like it would have been there, even that, though that was isolated to St. Louis and New Orleans, it was the same type of concept that he was going for.
And, it's something that obviously Walt was excited about in the 50s, and it was something that Michael Eisner, again, a lot of this is happening in the heart of the Disney decade. So when they announced this in 1993, Michael Eisner comes out and he wrote in a book about how much he loved this particular project, how passionate he was about it, how he personally made and looked at and approved the site and the plans for him. So this is one that I believe him when he says that he had a personal love in interest in doing when they announced this. Again, it's a 1,200 acre park when they announced it in 1993, in early 1993. Sorry, I think they announced it late. I want to say late, maybe like November 1993.
Yeah, it looks like it was November with the intention of opening in 98.
And oddly enough, it didn't have a $3 billion budget, which was nice. It was like a discount park. So I think $650 million or something. So
yeah, but I mean, clearly with some of these things that they had planning, it doesn't look like they were cutting costs. I mean, there's a little expedition. It looks kind of like what we get with Rapids. I mean, it's a river rapid type ride. There would have been the roller coaster in the called the Industrial Revolution in the Enterprise section that would have had you going twisting, turning through this turn of the century mill and avoiding the steel. And I mean, they had guys. I mean, the Victory Field, they would have had about using VR technology in the early 90s. So I don't know if you're envisioning like those giant old headsets back then that you would have had to have worn, but they wanted to use that to simulate, combat, like driving a tank and jumping out of a plane. I mean, they definitely had big ideas. Clearly they came up with some way to do it on a smaller budget.
And look, the intent of the park was to celebrate America and tell American history in a world, in a land, in the way that Walt probably would have wanted, where you're not just watching it, but you're living through it. So again, you mentioned the different areas. So the Crossroads takes place in, a Civil War era village that would have been sort of the hub of Disney's America, right? So we get that sort of sense of the 1840s. The Native American section would have taken place between like the 1600s and the 1800s. Start thinking Pocahontas, because that's probably they would have highlighted a lot of those mid-Atlantic tribes with exhibits and crafts and shows, and that Lewis and Clark, again, no good idea goes away. The Lewis and Clark expedition whitewater raft ride comes up. The President's Square is the mid 1750s to the 1800s. The Civil War fort would have had this circle vision attraction. The Enterprise, not as in Starship Enterprise, but in sort of the Industrial Revolution Enterprise, celebrating all of these important times and milestones in American history. Even sort of that in the We the People, this replica of what Ellis Island was going to be, in that family farm, again, which I hear family farm, I think this is something that is almost a tribute to Walt as well. And then you've got the Victory Field for the 1940s in terms of the World War eras. It sounds wonderful when you think about it, but what it instantly does is, from the moment that this is announced, and I remember, being a Disney fan and growing up in the Northeast, I remember vividly when this was announced, and very quickly starting to hear a lot of very loud, pre-internet, mind you, but still very, very loud opposition that seemed to be coming from a lot of different directions all at the same time.
Yeah, I think there's a couple really interesting quotes that come from within Disney. Michael Eisner was quoted in the Washington Post. He said, "We're going to be sensitive, but we will not be showing the absolute propaganda of the country." And then Bob Weiss, who was VP at the time, he said, "We're hoping to be really a little controversial and not be quite as nice and sweet as Disney parks may have been in the past." So immediately, one of the oppositions that they faced was, are they going to be able to depict history in an amusement theme park in a way that's respectful, specifically when it comes to Native American, African American history. There was a lot of concern.
Right. And this is actually something that still comes up sometimes when you have attractions like the American Adventure and this is not meant to veer off into a conversation but when that you depict history, there are choices that have to be made in terms of, do you show the glorious achievements and wonderful moments, or do you take a very honest, open look at everything that happened? And I think the idea, I play devil's advocate here. I think the idea was they wanted to theme this park and the attractions and the shows about real events that happened in American history, which in and of itself is going to cause controversy. And while some people complain now that current attractions maybe ignore some of the negative aspects of history, when you outwardly come out and say, yeah, we are going to do a park about the Civil War and we have to talk about slavery. And the quote that I read from Bob Weiss says, you are going to know what it was like to be a slave and to escape in the Underground Railroad. You have to believe, and I don't know Bob Weiss from Adam, you have to believe that the intention was, you need to understand how bad things really were. This is not going to be a park where you are just going to come and be laughing and smiling. Like, we have a responsibility and an obligation to address these things and make you understand. So truly a learning experience. Like, if you go to a museum, you see everything that takes place during those timeframes. I think Disney felt obligated and probably wanted to do that. And I think it came out and maybe it instantly caused a very, very outward negative backlash.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because on one of the last pages of the plan, the publication that they circulated, it has special events, and clearly they were very focused on education and getting this done right, because they were going to have a stage equipped to do battle reenactments. They were going to have facilities to televise political debates or public affairs programs. They wanted to host the American Teacher Awards there. And then they were also going to have an area that could serve as a symposium for journalists, writers, historians. And they thought there was even the potential in the future for like a newsroom, because they wanted to get it out there how important the free press and media were to American history, to our country and our freedoms as a whole. So I don't think that, people like to use the term Mickey Mouse. I don't think they were trying to Mickey Mouse this park at all. But obviously that close to Washington, D.C., there were a lot of people who had fears about that. Right.
And Disney very much tried to distance itself from Bob Weiss's comments, but the barn door was open. I mean, it had come out and he was speaking as a representative. And again, that's a very difficult line to toe between talking about American history without trivializing certain things while also not you want to make it something that's, interesting and enjoyable for people to come, while being sensitive to, look, a lot of bad things happened in our history and we can't forget or ignore that. And how do you sort of address it in this environment? As you start to talk it out, you're like, yeah, maybe this is not a good idea. Like, you instantly open yourself up for, debate and controversy. And that really is, I think, where some of the issues initially started, which was, is this going to be portrayed? What are the stories that are going to be told? Who is going to be telling them? The other thing too was local residents were like, whoa, you can't build here. Like, this is, for all intents and purposes, this is hallowed ground. I mean, there were battles fought here, and now you want to bring in, to usual, a Mickey Mouse park. Is it going to be a respectful museum type thing, or is it going to be a Mickey Mouse entertainment venue? Understandable concern from the people who were living there, even though that the state of Virginia was willing to give Disney, I think it was $150 or so million to help with the infrastructure, because they realize, obviously, the incredible influx of tourism, translated money, that it was going to bring into the state. Although residents are like, wait a minute, we're not spending our tax dollars to pay for a Disney theme park. So, like, there were instant sort of people at loggerheads, right out of the gate.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that there were some heavy hitters that hopped on board here of fighting this off. You have David McCullough, who's a well-known historian. If anyone's ever seen John Adams' HBO series, is based on David McCullough's book, John Adams. He wrote 1776. At that point in time, he was doing a show on PBS. I think it's The American Experience. Back in the 90s, he was doing that. And then he's joined by Nick Coates, Pulitzer Prize journalist, White House counsel to LBJ Harry McPherson, a PR consultant for Reagan. They've got all these people combined together, and they quickly realize we can't really come at them as far as what they're going to put in this park because of First Amendment rights. They're allowed, they accepted that you can, put whatever you want in there, but they decided to really fight them on the location. Like you said, there was just too much fear regarding, is there going to be damage done to the battlefield? How are you dealing with traffic in this area? And is there going to be pull from people wanting to visit the actual historical areas like Mount Vernon, like the battlefield, like all of the different locations in Washington, D.C. itself?
Right. And you can't really, there's no way to tell what the impact and what the reception would have been, putting it there, putting it in a different location. And for a long time, it seemed like, Michael Eisner was still very much on board with the idea, even in before the project was officially shelved in 94. There were some Disney PR materials came out, and he talked about Disney's America he talked about how it's going to celebrate the qualities which have been the source of strength and the beacon of hope for people to everywhere. And the nation is a rich mixture of land, family, and beliefs, which we apply with our own brand of spirit, humor, and imagination. So he really wanted to celebrate the stories and the histories and the cultural diversities and the progress and problems that we encountered. Again, like I think, I'm sort of thinking, the story of the American Adventure film, trying to recap all of American history, although it's relatively short compared to other cultures, in a land where guests could have a very participatory role in it. But from the very beginning of the official announcement, there were those problems, and it didn't take very long for Disney to officially shelve the project in early fall 1994.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting even to think about this today of, no good idea dies, no good idea goes away at Disney. But you look at, not to get into a political discussion, but you look at how fraught even the Hall of Presidents was when it reopened the last time. It's hard to imagine that a park like this could be built in the current climate.
Yeah. Yeah. Anytime that there's something like this, there are going to be opposing views and opposing sides. But Disney, they were not necessarily done with the idea when Knott's Berry Farm was selling part of its property in 1995. Imagineers, there was a there's a replica of Independence Hall at the farm, and they're like, well, wait a minute, maybe this can be where we want to build Disney's America. And supposedly Knott's Berry Farm, shelved that idea. But they did take some of the aspects of it. So the idea for Victory Field sort of became part of what Condor Flats was, which is now the Grizzly Peak Airfield. There was actually, at DCA, when it first opened, there was an area known as Bountiful Valley Farm that took some of the inspiration there. That's gone. It's where Cars Land was. I think Grizzly River Run reminds me of what this Lewis and Clark river raft expedition was supposed to be. And maybe to a certain degree, Paradise Pier was meant to be that state fair aspect of it, with the Ferris wheel and the wooden roller coaster, which is what that state fair of the 30s and 40s Coney Island-ish was supposed to be, which was a 60-foot Ferris wheel and a wooden roller coaster. So they did take some of those aspects and idea, the non-controversial ones, and were able to bring them over. But if you take the, and I know that you can't, but in this fantasy world that I'm talking about, if you sort of take the political and controversial and some of the really difficult parts and conversations of it, it really would be fascinating to be able to walk through and take your kids to be able to walk through and see what different parts of America and American history looked and felt like during those times. That's what gets me excited about the idea for Disney's America, right? Seeing what a Native American village would have been like, seeing what life was like in the 1800s and that colonial village. We get a sense of it in a very simple way in Liberty Square. It's another thing to have this big land with boats and things like that, and like what Walt wanted for the Liberty Street in Disneyland, getting the feel that there were residents there that were blacks. I'm taking the residents of Batuu and Galaxy's Edge and sort of taking that concept that they all have their own story to tell in this environment that we get to walk through and live in. You want to teach your kids about American history. Like, that's a really neat way to let them learn and maybe even get them excited about something that they wouldn't have been excited about before.
Yeah, and it's just another instance of Disney doing edutainment great. I mean, we talk about that with Liberty Square, like you say, but this would have been times 20.
Yeah. And I still, like I said, I don't think that idea necessarily is dead. But one of the other ones that, and again, I'm hoping that everybody hasn't heard of all these, because I think that there was one that a lot of people either have never heard of, or maybe they think it's this urban legend. And when we talk about the SS Disney, I don't mean the first iteration of what the Disney Cruise Line was going to be.
Yeah, I think this is where that phrase "next level bonkers," like that defines this. This is like, I looked at my kid and I said, "Hey, you get to design a theme park today." And because he's really into boats right now, he said, "Let's build it on a boat." Yeah.
See, I love this idea, and I don't think it's as bonkers as it sounds based on the size and what some of these ships are building today. But if you haven't guessed, the SS Disney was literally going to be a theme park on and in and sort of all around a giant ship. And again, Michael Eisner, it's the Eisner era. It was a wacky time in the 90s, right? The military was really sort of downsizing post-Cold War, and they're getting rid of some of their own, aircraft carriers and some of the ships, and it's hard to sell those on eBay. The PayPal fees are just through the roof. And as legend has it, at some charity dinner, a Navy admiral and a Disney executive are talking. There's probably a couple of cocktails flowing around, and somebody says something about this floating theme park. What if you just take a theme park and just throw it on one of the ships, and somebody goes, wait a minute, that's not the worst idea I ever heard of in the world. And all of a sudden, the idea for the SS Disney is born. They think we're making this up, but I swear this is not a joke.
Yeah, I saw this, and the first thing I thought when I heard the SS Disney, I was like, what is the SS Disney? So I looked it up, and I'm like, no, this is like that thing you see on April Fool's Day where they say that they're building a park in Canada.
And I think it probably did start as a joke.
You have to be pranking me.
Right.
But then I found the model.
But it probably did start as a joke. It probably started like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if you could put, these aircraft carriers are so big, you could probably put a theme park on top. And all of a sudden the guy's like, wait, I want to make a name for myself in Imagineering. I think this is how I'm going to do it.
Well, and he finds another Imagineer, Mark Hickson, who actually has shipbuilding experience. And he says, no, wait, you don't want an aircraft carrier. You want an oil tanker. Let's go even bigger. And yeah, I mean, the top of this thing was going to have attractions on the top. You have all this interior volume on an oil tanker where they were going to redo things like Space Mountain and Dumbo and the teacups and the Orbitron. And It's a Small World, the facade was going to cover the pilot house to kind of disguise it. I mean, you would enter on this glass covered hub, and it was going to have Tomorrowland, Adventureland, and Fantasyland that were going to, spoke off of that entrance section. And, we're talking restaurants, and it would pull up to locations around the world where Disney was not able to build a permanent theme park. And it would dock, and they would have this portable dock, and people would be allowed to get on for 8 hours at a time. And they thought that it could probably hold around 10,000 guests at a time. And they'd be able to do 2 different periods during the day. And because it was going to have about half the amount of rides of a normal theme park. And so they thought people could probably get done in 8 hours. So they'd go on, have their fun. Those people leave for the day. Cast members stay in a secondary ship. And half the cast members would travel with the boat when it moved to a new port, and half of them they would hire in that port so that there would be people who knew the language. And it would move every few months so that they would have this exposure in countries where there were no Disney parks.
It literally sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, right? And if you look at the model, and I'll try and see if I can get some photos to put in the show notes. There is a white scale model that is built to incredible detail, and it almost does look like your kid took his G.I. Joe aircraft carrier and then took his Legos and his little, they used to sell for the monorail system. They used to sell like these little mini versions of attractions and just starts putting them on top of a ship, because that's exactly what it kind of looks like. But it really isn't that far away from ships now that have go-kart attractions and other rides and stuff up on top of the deck. And when you said, 18 attractions, which is, about maybe half of what Magic is, that's a lot. And 10,000 guests. Again, you need to put that in sort of context and relation to what some of the current mega ships have, which is much less than half that. It's theoretically, it was a doable thing, and it was an idea that both Eisner and Wells, Roy and Disney, Eisner and Wells were excited about. And thought that it was something that could happen, by the turn of the century. They thought that, by 2000, this was something that they could absolutely make happen. And you can see by the detail in the model that, from an engineering and a size point of view, it's something that absolutely could happen.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things on the model, when you look at the captions with some of the pictures, is that there was supposed to be an Aladdin dark ride, which for years, my sister and I, we grew up in the Disney Renaissance. We're like, why? Why do we only get the magic carpets of Aladdin? Like, why is this not something better? So that piqued my interest.
But yeah, there was obviously, a ton of different themed retail shops for Tomorrowland and Fantasyland. There was a Disney store, obviously. Right? I don't even need to say that out loud. A lot of themed restaurants as well, and shows and whatnot. So you would have that Disney theme park experience literally at sea in a very different way than what we have currently with Disney Cruise Line. I mean, this was going to be truly a theme park at sea. And if you look at the models and see the size and the scope and the scale of what they were looking to build, it almost looks as though it should be something that would just be docked somewhere and not actually float.
Yeah, and we're not talking short distances either that they were planning on taking this. They were looking at locations in the Western Pacific and Australia. I mean, I don't know how long that would have taken to travel that far. It seems like that would have left them with a lot of downtime versus how much time that they would have been able to charge people who are coming in.
Yeah, but just think, if you're going to take a trip around the world, this is the ship that you want to do it on. I mean, it would have been, $90,000 per person.
Well, they did say that no one was going to be allowed to actually be on it when it was moving from port to port. It was just going to be when it docked, you got on, you got to experience it. And then at the end of the night or the end of your 8-hour period, you got off. And that even the permanent cast members wouldn't have ridden on the actual oil tanker. They would have had their own ship that they were transported on.
But imagine what it would be like if you could build that and then actually convert some of the lower decks to, habitable quarters for, guests and cast, and be able to do. So it sounds ridiculous and awesome all at the same time. Why does it not happen? Other than the fact that it's ridiculous and awesome.
Really, the only reason I could find is this happened around the same time that Frank Wells died. And he was, like you said, it was the Walt and Roy, it was Eisner and Wells. And Eisner still really liked the idea, but without Wells there to help push it forward, it just didn't happen. And and corporate kind of said, we think really if you want to do something on a boat, an actual cruise ship is going to be a better way to go.
And I hate to keep on, pointing the finger at poor Euro Disneyland, but, look, the expectations were very, very high for it. It was, I said it before, it was hemorrhaging $1 million a day. That is not something that a company cannot ignore. And with that park not doing well, attendance not even being close to what they expected, lots of other, things sort of gnawing away at the idea, it didn't really get much farther than that oh so very beautiful model. And I have no idea where it is or whose possession it is in. But if you do a search, you can find photos of it online. And look, it does end up, becoming the Disney Cruise Line, which I am obviously a massive fan of. And I think I very quickly want to touch on one. I know we talked about the plans for domestic parks. There is one that was rumored and still continues to come up. I have a bunch of friends that I have met through the show who live down under, who every so often will say, Mangello, now's the time to buy property because Disney is coming to the Gold Coast of Australia. They may not be right now, but for a little while, that was something that was absolutely being considered once again, during the Eisner era back in the 1990s, and this secret plan for a Disney resort that went relatively far in the planning.
I'm going to be honest. You surprised me with this one.
See, oh, that's awesome. So from what I understand, there were plans for a Disney resort in or around Sydney, Australia, and supposedly there were meetings between Eisner and property developers that had gone on back and forth. And then at one point, supposedly Eisner was like, you know what, if we're going to go anywhere, the place that I want to go to is China as opposed to Australia. Although there were talks about the similar types of things with the elements of Disney theme parks and themed hotels, that marina, that ferry wharf, light rail station, retail space, possibly an area for, ships to come in and dock, and some ideas that supposedly were originally planned for there and then eventually make their way to places like Shanghai and Hong Kong. This was supposedly codenamed Project Lester, and it was described as an integrated Disney destination to live, work, play, and learn. This may have very well been one of those things of trying to get people to invest in Australian real estate, but supposedly there were conversations back and forth with Disney, and it seemed as though it was going to be a done deal in the early to mid 90s, but eventually Disney looked elsewhere. This again seems to come up in conversation and rumors all the time. I don't know if Australia is accessible enough to enough people to make that be the next place I think Disney would go. So the question I have for you, Kendall, and you, our friend, the listener, is, do you think there's a chance, an opportunity for another domestic Disney theme park?
I want to say yes, because clearly we're reaching max capacity at Disney World. I mean, it's why they're altering ticket prices. Everyone says, why does it keep getting more expensive? I mean, there's only so much supply. Clearly, people are wanting to vacation at new locations that Disney produces. And so I think from a business standpoint, it seems like if they were able to come up with a third location, that people would travel there. But when it comes down to selecting where, that just seems like the biggest barrier. Because are you going to move to another area where there's, all year round great weather? How many options are there for that? And you've kind of got it covered on both coasts. So are you going to try to do something that's all indoors? And are you able to create the same environment when it's all contained inside of a small area? And obviously there's other additional expenses that come along with it, like what we talked about with the St. Louis Riverfront. When you're having to contain it all in a building, that requires massive expense of a massive building. But I wish it would happen.
Well, but you're right. Where becomes part of the issue, right? And everybody obviously wants it in their backyard. And one of the things we actually didn't talk about was I can't call it a planned park, but there was always a bit of a desire to have a Disney theme park in or around New York City. Walt had talked about wanting to have a park on the East Coast somewhere, and with so many guests visiting New York, passing through New York, that seemed like the perfect hub. Look, even today, and I'm ballparking numbers, obviously, a vast majority of visitors to Walt Disney World come from the Northeast, the tri-state area, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. So it makes perfect sense to build something, you build where the people are, give them something to go to. There were rumors for a long, long time of Disney planning to build and having financing from NBC of companies. It was one of the ones I remembered hearing from, trying to figure out, how they could do it. Obviously, it would only be, literally a fair weather park, right? It could not be open in the winter due to the inclement weather. And supposedly Buzz Price, again, looked at building, at one point, building what was going to be the next Disneyland in New York. We talked about it earlier, versus Florida. And he had done a report, obviously showing why Florida was a much better choice, and the winters and whatnot were going to significantly impact the revenue. Plus, like Florida, Walt wanting not to build by the beach, Walt didn't want to build in New York because you've got other distractors. You've got museums and Broadway and other things to do other than just going to a Disney park. So, we hear about Disneyland East and Disney New York and New York. It was a New Jersey locations that were talked about it too. But you're right, trying to find that ideal location that satisfies all of the requirements are difficult. You have that same issue going to someplace like Chicago. You have other issues if you go to a place like Dallas in terms of being right in the middle. Going to Marceline, Missouri makes no sense because it's difficult to access. Where is there a chance for another domestic park? I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what listeners would say in terms of the actual feasibility of it happening. But the question I have for you, of all the things that we talked about today in terms of these true unrealized concepts, from the SS Disney to WESTCot to Port Disney to God, there's so many I hardly remember, to St. Louis, to which of those that we covered today, including Texposition and Mineral King, which of those different concepts would you like to have seen be built most?
I have to go with WESTCot. I mean, I agree with Marty Sklar that you don't want a sequel, but to me, it just seems fundamentally different from Epcot. Even though it was inspired by it, and you can obviously see similarities, there's also drastic differences. And it might be because it was one of the ones that was more fleshed out, so there's more that you can grab a hold of and say, oh, I would have loved that. I would have loved that. But I love Epcot, and I love the things that they discuss in those articles on WESTCot. I mean, the River of Time cruise, the different, world wonders, and, all down, even down to the waterfall coming out of the bottom of the gold sphere. Like, it just sounds like it would have been beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, look, there were smaller ideas and smaller expansions that we didn't even touch on. Lest we forget Hyperion Wharf. When Hyperion Wharf was going to come to Walt Disney World a few years ago, and some of the other plans for expansions of Disneyland. But in terms of unique properties, unique locations that were going to be built, I want to know from you, our friend, the listener, which one of these would you have most liked to see built, and why? The best way to let us know is by being part of the community and conversation by going to wdwradio.com/community. That will take you to our Facebook group. You can also call the voicemail, be heard on the air, and really articulate, share in your most passionate way which one you'd like to have seen and visited, and why. 407-900-9391. Kendall, do you want to share anything about where people can find you online, or maybe just in the Box People group?
Yeah, I'm in the Box People group. If you want to follow my sparse and random Twitter musings, you can do that
Way to sell it.
yeah, at KL_Foreman, FOREMAN. But I would say the best place if you want to know anything about me and my trips to Disney is just to look for me on the WDW radio blog. I was editor for 6 years just recently. Hard choice, gave that up, but I'm still going to continue writing, and there's plenty of evergreen content back there if you look me up. And yeah,
awesome. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate you suggesting such a great topic. I mean, there's so much to think about and dream about and wonder what might have been. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you being here with us today, and I cannot wait to see you on board the SS Disney.
You too. We'll take a trip on the Aladdin Dark Ride.
So bizarre. So bizarre. Although it was supposed to have a Flynn's arcade on it. So
I did not see that.
That alone.
Your dream would have come true.
That's right. Where does one park an aircraft carrier?
Yeah.
It's time for our Walt Disney World Trivia Question of the Week, where I invite you to test your knowledge of Walt Disney World history or see how well you pay attention to the details, sometimes in what you see or hear, and yes, maybe even eat. And if you think you know the answer, you can enter via our online form for a chance to win a Disney prize package. Of course, before we get to this week's question, we're going to go back, review last week's, and select our winner. So I said last week that before I ever did my very first live dining review, one of the first restaurants I highlighted in Walt Disney World wasn't necessarily because of its food, although I do love it, but the details. I love those too. The stories, the histories, and hidden treasures in my very first DSI Disney Scene Investigation segment. And your question last week simply was to tell me what show and restaurant was the subject of my very first DSI. Thanks to the hundreds of you who entered, not only who got this correct, but shared memories of when you started listening, when you went back to listen, how different this show was versus some newer shows, and lots more. I really, really appreciate you sharing your stories as well as your answer, which was, of course, show number 3, and that was Pecos Bill. I did my first DSI. We talked about the story and the details, and if you listen to the entire episode, we also talked about some new Disney Cruise Line ships that were just being announced, as well as some new Disney rumors. And it's sometimes fun and interesting to go back and hear what was rumor back in 2007 versus what is current in 2019. Anyway, I took all of the correct entries, randomly selected one. Again, last week you were playing for all my digital products, which is my 102 ways to save money for an at Walt Disney World book, all 7 of my virtual audio walking tours of said secrets and stories and history of the Magic Kingdom. You can find those in iTunes, the book in Amazon. I'm also going to send you a WDW Radio vinyl sticker not available anywhere else, as well as a pop socket for your phone and a snazzy WDW Radio t-shirt. So last week's winner, randomly selected, is Bella Alvarado. So Bella, thank you for using the form. Thank you for sending the correct entry and a wonderful story, by the way. You are our winner. I have your address. I will get your prize package out to you right away. If you played last week and didn't win, that's okay, because here's your next chance to enter in this week's Walt Disney World Trivia Challenge. So this week here in America, we will be celebrating we celebrate July 4th everywhere on the planet, but this week we'll be celebrating our American independence. So I thought we would go with some trivia about our great nation in the parks. Now, I have to tell you that Magic Kingdom is my favorite of the parks, and really over the last few years, probably when I first started working on my Liberty Square audio tour, I really came to know and understand and have a greater and deeper appreciation of this land. And really it has become, although there's not a lot of attractions in there other than the mansion and Hall of Presidents, I love it because of just how rich it is. And it's also one that I have personal memories of as a kid, walking and wandering through, either on my way to the Haunted Mansion or heading the other way towards Frontierland. And back in the 70s, there was actually a daily ceremony that was held in Liberty Square, and it involved a fife and drum corps, and there were cast members, and they were all in this wonderful colonial-era, revolutionary-style costuming. And during this ceremony, and sort of mini parade, as it were, cast members would choose a boy and a girl from the crowd to be part of this celebration. They would get this little commemorative scroll. It was very, very cool. I never got selected, which still haunts me to this day, but I want to know, I'm over it, it's okay. I want to know, what was the name of this daily fife and drum corps celebration in Liberty Square that ran in the late throughout the 70s into the early 80s. You have until Sunday, July 2nd, to go to WDWRadio.com, click on this week's podcast, use the form there. Again, you'll play for all the digital products, the books, the 7 audio tours, the vinyl sticker, and a pop socket, and I'll give you a choice. You can either have a WDW Radio shirt, or you can have a mystery prize from the Mystery Prize Closet. So good luck, God bless America, and have fun. That's going to do it for this week's show. Thank you so very much for taking the time to tune in this and every week. Please don't forget that I want you to be part of the community and conversation by going to WDWRadio.com/community and joining our Box People group there. I also want to give huge thanks, speaking of community, to the new and longtime members of our WDW Radio Nation family. I appreciate your love and support and friendship and help. I want to thank Kelly Clevenger, Dana Kramer, Jeff Matheson, and Chris Reynolds. They are just a few of the new members who have joined our WDW Radio Nation family and will get exclusive rewards like monthly scavenger hunts. We have a private Facebook group, custom Magic Band covers, logo gear, t-shirts, monthly care packages from Walt Disney World. We also have exclusive live video group calls, early access and discounts to special events, and more. To find out how you can help support the show, visit WDWRadio.com/support. Again, it is completely optional, greatly appreciated, and don't forget that not only is it a great way for you to help show your support for the show, but a portion of your contribution does go to our Dream Team project to directly benefit the Make-A-Wish Foundation of America. Please also don't forget to join me every Wednesday night at 7:30 p.m. Eastern at WDWRadioLive.com. That's my live weekly video show on Facebook where you can not only be part of the show, but call in with your questions and comments. Again, that's every Wednesday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. The best way to make sure you get notified is to, 1, subscribe to our free email newsletter at WDWRadio.com. Also, by turning on notifications on Facebook. If you have a question you want me to answer on the air, you can email me, lou@WDWRadio.com, or be heard on the air yourself by calling the voicemail at 407-900-9391 with a question, a comment, or just a hello from the parks. You can also connect with me elsewhere on social. I am at Lou Mangello on the Twitter, Instagram, where I'm sharing a lot more in terms of stories and unique content there. And of course, as much as I love connecting with you online, nothing beats a handshake and a hug. Stay tuned for our next Meet of the Month in Walt Disney World. I think this July we're going to do our annual day at the Walt Disney World Water Park, something a little bit different, sort of spend the afternoon and early evening together. Stay tuned for details. That will happen in mid to late July. I'm going to lock in a date and I'll announce it on the show probably next week, but most likely earlier on the WDW Radio group in Facebook. Again, it's WDWRadio.com/community. And if you visit the events page at WDWRadio.com/events, you can find out about other events, not just in Walt Disney World, but our Adventures by Disney to Japan, our group cruise next February out of New Orleans, and lots of other events coming up as well. I also invite you to please visit LouMangello.com. There I can help you turn what you love into what you do by either working with you one-on-one. I still have availability for my weekly mastermind group and my Momentum Weekend Workshop in Walt Disney World this September 28th and 29th. It is a weekend of inspiration, education, and community where you'll not only learn, but get to execute on what you learn right in the room, as well as meet and work with others right away to help you take your idea, your brand, your business to the next level. Whether you're a blogger, a podcaster, a content creator, or own a brick and mortar store, we will be able to help you. This is the last week I will be accepting speaker submissions, and I'll also be announcing our first round of speakers, including our keynote speaker in the past. We've had Lee Cockrell, Dan Cockrell, Duncan Wardle, Ashley Eckstein from Star Wars and Her Universe, as well as others who literally have walked the walk and will be in the room to help you turn what you love into what you do. Again, to find out more, take advantage of the early bird pricing, visit LouMongello.com, click on the Momentum tab. Thanks as always to Becky Mankin and the entire team over at Mousefan Travel. It's who I recommend because it's who I love and it's who I personally use, and more importantly, it's who I trust for you and your Disney vacation, whether you're going to World, Land, Cruise, Adventures by Disney, or anywhere on the planet. Becky and her team of agents give you the best possible prices, all available discounts with an incredible level of personal service, all which costs you absolutely nothing. To find out more, get a free no obligation quote, visit mousefantravel.com, and don't forget to visit celebrationspress.com to order back issues of Celebrations magazine. And as always, my friend, and you are my friend, whether we have met yet or not, all I ask is that if you like the show, and I really hope that you do, please help spread the word. Let your friends know about it by tweeting out that you're listening, sharing a link to this or your favorite episode on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Pinterest. And if you can, it's like 15, 30 seconds tops to rate and review the show over in iTunes. It is incredibly, incredibly helpful and so very much appreciated. Thanks to you, we have more than 2,000 five-star reviews and really need to keep those coming. I want to thank some recent reviewers like Park Hopper Dean from Australia, which is amazing to me that somebody on the other side of the planet listens to the show. He says it's a touch of magic from 10,000 miles away. Living in Australia, Disney magic is harder to come by until I started listening to Lou. His knowledge and passion, especially for the food, for Disney is something that I didn't know I was missing until I found him. He makes my daily car ride so much easier, and I'm currently making my way back through the past episodes as I wait for weekly new ones. It's safe to say that my love for Disney has grown tenfold, and it's all thanks to Lou. I may not be able to give Lou the handshake and the hug just yet, but I hope this review is enough thanks for now. Park Hopper Dean, I promise we'll make that happen one day. Hophead from the U.S. says, it lives up to its rating. It's hard to believe exceptional ratings on a podcast, but WDW Radio lives up to it. It's as informative as it is entertaining. It may be aimed at Disney nerds and fans, but it's accessible to members of the broader audience planning a first visit to Walt Disney World. Lou Mongello, a Disney character himself, easily flows from travel tips, I think it's a compliment, restaurant reviews, park history, and movie trivia. This is a podcast for every level of Disney interest. Just dive in. And Jesse Allard says, my dad's been listening to the podcast for years, and whenever I was in the car, I would listen as well. I'm now listening to the podcast when I am driving, and I love every second of that. I love hearing that because, one, I love the fact that it sounds like you literally have sort of grown up listening, but that parents know that the show is one that is safe, that they can listen to with their kids. So Dean, Hophead is Tom S. and Jesse, thank you so very much. Again, just search for WDW Radio on iTunes or go to www.radio.com/iTunes for a link and instructions on how to leave the review. Again, thank you so, so very much. I cannot tell you how much I truly love you. Forgetting not even maybe being friends, whether we've met yet or not. I love you whether we've met yet or not, because you are giving me the gift of being able to do what I do every day and share it with you and hopefully have just even a small bit of a positive impact on your life. And if there's any way that I can do something more, whether it's at Momentum or with the show, please, please let me know. For all that you give to me, just by virtue of your time and attention, I sincerely want to be able to give back any way that I can. In the meantime, I hope that this truly is your best week ever, and that every day is positive and fun and filled with joy and happiness. So until next time, see ya.
Hi, Lou. It's Brad and Amy Peterson from Boyceville, Wisconsin, calling from Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland. We've just loved Galaxy's Edge, and I've only cried a few times. We're about to enter Olga's Cantina for the third time so we can finish trying all the beverages in honor of Becky. We've had fun in L.A. traveling to important Disney sites and taking a tour of the Walt Disney Studios. On our drive, we listened to your overlooked experiences for adults at WDW, and I wanted to add golf at one of the Disney golf courses to the list. The Sunrise 9 and Sunset 9 packages are really affordable and include food and beverage before and after the round. That's a great way to take a break from the crowds. We hope to say hi to you and for a handshake and a hug at D23 in August. Thank you for your great shows and the awesome community of the Vox Nation. Have a wonderful day.
Hi, Lou. It's Elizabeth from Massachusetts. I just finished listening to your most recent episode, 557, about the most overlooked adult experiences. And I am so glad you did this topic. It's something that I spend a lot of time convincing family and friends to travel down to Disney World with me and explaining to them all of the great things that are available for adults that go beyond, like you said, just the ride and the characters and the cutesy stuff. So what's so funny, too, is I also listened to episode 206 earlier today, where you actually did the review of the Africa trek. So I know that you sort of started out with that in the episode, and I agree. I think all of those backstage experiences are things that are totally overlooked and can really make or have adults learn more rather than just walking through the park, and they can kind of experience and understand just how intricate and detailed these parks are. I also am so glad you brought up Sanaa. My mom and I dream about that bread day after day after day. We love it so much, and now I'm excited to go back, and I have an excuse because I've never been there actually for the late night lounge. I also think that you guys talked about Disney Springs, and I think that what they've done and how they've transformed the springs from downtown Disney. At first, I remember being kind of like a teenager and thinking, oh, I hate what they're doing to this. I don't like the name. And I mean, I still call it downtown Disney all the time. But there was the sense of like, not that it wasn't unclassy, but I would say now Disney Springs is a classy place where you can go and have fun with friends, family, and as an adult, you don't feel like you're in Disney World, and I think that's super important. One thing that was not mentioned is it does involve a few adult beverages. Friends and I that go pretty frequently absolutely love the Baseline Tap House in Hollywood Studios. I think it's totally overlooked. They have really good local and a lot of California brewed beers, as well as some wines. And the charcuterie boards there are absolutely unreal. And I'm coming from someone who travels around the world in search of the perfect meat and cheese boards. I've been, to France and Amsterdam and Copenhagen and Spain. And I will tell you, I really, 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 really love that charcuterie board they do there. And then I know that for adults, like you had said, there's so many experiences that don't involve alcohol, but I think what's important, and my friends and I will drink around the world almost every time we go. But we do so in a way that's not crazy. Like, we split drinks not only for the purposes of, it's 11 drinks, but for the monetary reason too, because it ends up acting up. Hi, Lou. It's Elizabeth again from Massachusetts. I guess my message was too long, which I'll go fast now, because I got cut out on the last one. But I was just talking about how even though drinking around the world kind of has this connotation, it can be an activity that is a ton of fun to do with friends. And my friends and I will still complete the KitKat things purely because we actually enjoy it and it makes us feel like a kid again. We also split the drinks, like I said, mostly for monetary reasons too, because it ends up being so expensive. But I agree with you that I think that there is a place for adults in Walt Disney World. There always will be. And what Disney is continuing to do with the parks and the downtown, oh my gosh, there, I said it again, in the Disney Springs area, it have been amazing. So, yeah, I think that they're calculated in the way that they release alcohol into the parks, and I think that Disney is doing a great job at making Disney World an experience for adults to have fun and enjoy too. So this episode, I absolutely loved it. To come down to the world for Christmas with me this year. Okay, I will talk to you soon. Thanks so much for all the work you do. Totally appreciate it. Bye.